I have to say that we were given a lot of homework by Romy, and we will our time will be spent trying to fulfill, but we might not be able to do that. Secondly, I'm not a finance guy. My co-panelists are finance guys. I am an economist of the real economy, so I will be a little bit different. And you will find my presentation probably a little less nosebleed than the presentation this morning. But I will start with where they ended. They ended with the discussion of attenuated fiscal space and how to deal with the attenuated fiscal space. There is, of course, a way to attenuate, to deal with narrow fiscal space, and that is that we have to outgrow it. The best way is to outgrow it. You grow the economy rapidly, and suddenly the debt is a smaller percentage every time. But how do you grow in these trying times rapidly? Of course, when you think of growth, you think about investment, and that is where I will start, because there's the iron law of development is that if you don't invest, you just don't grow. So the debt burden problem is where I'll start, and my viewpoint is to outgrow it and by rapid investment. The problem is that, of course, whereas in 2016, when the last administration started, money was flowing out of its ears. And DBB was tremendously financially supported. Now, that is not the case. The chill is empty. And the clamor for safety net is even greater. And this was alluded already by the last two speakers. So there might not be just enough fiscal fat to throw at investment. And what is going to happen? Well, we probably have to think about taxes, new taxes and higher taxes that are already existent. And that is, of course, the other is borrowing, which will probably be also dangerous, as mentioned by Diwa, because if your debt outgrows your economy, then you are headed for Sri Lanka, and we don't want that trajectory. First of all, our investment rate is not very high relative to our most immediate rivals in the region. So at best, I think between 23 and 25, there were some quarters in the last administration where our investment rate was 25%, and that made me happy. But maintaining it, I think on the average it's about between 22 and 23% of GDP. Now, this was before the pandemic, so remember that our neighbors are doing between 25 and 40 investment rate. And that is why, over the years, we just looked worse and worse relative to them. Not relative to other countries, but relative to our near neighbors. We looked worse and worse, infrastructure-wise especially. So now, what do we do, given these trying circumstances? Well, I have to say that we need BBP even more this time around. I know that Von will talk about it, but I still want to emphasize it. Re-emphasizing it is no harm. And on this issue, there are two things that I'd like to add, and something that you know already. I think the government has to recast the current unsigned IRR and come out with an IRR with a strong MAGA provision, rather than a provision that was kind of weakened. And along these lines, I think that this administration will help itself if it declares a rigorous policy of rule of law. Meaning to say, if the government signs a contract, then follow it through. If your part of the contract says that you have to allow the concessionaires recompense. If you don't agree, then you go to the courts, and if the courts says that your partners in PPP deserve recompense, just pay it. It will pay for itself over the long run. So allowed rule of law pronouncement by the seat of government, I think is quite important. But not only for PPP, for foreign investments in general, I think it is quite important. Remember that we have to dispel the idea that we can violate rules of law, and still maintain high attractiveness for investment. You must remember that, for example, this is already known to you. Create is a great thing. Create 2 is a great thing. Except that in the process you also removed tax holidays, or you increased the taxes for PESA locators, because 5% gross is actually equal to 17% CIT, or corporate income tax. This is not mine. This is DOF, and so it's interesting that at 17% CIT before the create, we were equal to Vietnam. Vietnam offers 17% CIT for 10 years to locators. So we need to dispel that negative attitude that the last administration has left behind. The second is we have to reopen sectors. For so long we have closed 2 sectors, 3 essentially, because agri was essentially no-go for private money, private business. Big private business have essentially moved away from the farming sector, and that is really quite sad. And of course, this has something to do with our advocacy in FEF, something to do with fragmentation of land ownership, difficulty of leasehold, so that big business do not want to own big tracts of land. They want to cultivate big tracts of land, but they don't necessarily have to own it. But you have to have an architecture by which that is done easily. If MDP has to sign on 1,000 land reform beneficiaries to get 10,000 hectares, He's not interested. But of course, who would? So we have to reopen the agri-sector. And there are bills that we support. Actually, FEF supports. Not only ownership, but loosening up the rules for leasing for bigger farms. Then, of course, you have to also loosen up mining. Ano to eh? What do you call? Lying fruits ito eh. Andyan eh. But, for example, take the gold and copper in Bukidnon. The government already said, let's do it. Let's lift the open pit. But the locals are saying no. So you have to be able to iron out the problems. Because that open pit, that gold and copper in Bukidnon is $6 billion. 2,000 very good paying jobs. And it's not going anywhere unless we are able to take care of the gridlocks. Forestry. Well, I know that Toti is very strong on this. We are afraid of opening these sectors up because we know that we are quite weak in governance. But we don't need to be weak in governance all the time. Remember, when we concessionared water distribution in Metro Manila, water in Metro Manila was very badly managed. But we wrote a good concession contract, and the concession contract took care of a lot of the problems. And really, that is a template now. So we can do the same for mining and forestry. We can write contracts in such a way that we take care of these things. As we took care of water distribution in Metro Manila. I'd like also to call for more pro-tradable sector policy. These people are calling for this already, but they don't call it that way. In other words, people are calling for agri. I'm happy that there is a consciousness about the importance of agri, but we should treat this thing together as tradables. Tradables means agri, manufacturing. Yeah? So, for example, part of that pro-tradable policy would be that all manufacturing establishments, as well as agribusiness establishments, when they pay their power rates, I call for their power rates to be exempt from universal charges. Charges that we inherited from the past because of mismanagement. I think that government should just simply say, akin to. Okay, you just do your job. Akin to. So immediately, by the way, Germany does this, because Germany loves its manufacturing. That's where it thinks it is best. Therefore, that's one signal that you have a pro-tradable ecology. I call it a pro-tradable ecology. So one clear pro-tradable ecology, starting with, let us say, exempting manufacturing and agribusiness from the travails or ravages of the past. And of course, I am also, together with Joey, I'm an advocate of solar and wind renewables. Solar and wind renewables. When I travel, or when I'm on top of a building looking down, you see all these rooftops completely idle, potentially solar power farms. By the way, good news, Gokongwei has solarized all 24 of its malls and sites. Now, Gokongwei is now also a power company because it is producing about 23 kilowatts, megawatts of power. But that's only part of its rooftops. If it completely covers its rooftops, it will probably be in the 40s or 50s. Now, you are going to say, some of you are going to say, let's go nuclear. That's good. I have no objection. The problem is, we've been talking about that for a long time. But it is in the case of solar and rooftop, businesses are going ahead of government. Government is very far behind. Although government has a lot of idle rooftops as well. So in terms of investment, quick turnaround. You sign a contract today, 3 months later, the juice starts flowing. If you're net metered, you're helping the grid. Now, para sa akin, 1 gigawatt of power is doable. All that rooftops there, they're doing nothing. So that's one area that we can. I congratulate both appointees for going very strongly into battery, and ASEAN for investing very strongly as well in solar. Now, you might say these are small potatoes, but you know, if you have 1,000 of these small potatoes, you will have a large potato. Anyway, now with that introduction, may I go to my slides? I will go fast because, okay, the current problem with 56 per dollar is something we have already encountered in 2004, December, we already were there. And of course it started to decelerate until in January 2008, it was already at 40. Again, we had an episode where we were at 40, and DIWA remembers this, 2013. And in this case, I applaud the central bank for fighting appreciation tooth and nail, because it was at the rate it was going to 35. The central bank fought it using very high interest rates. I'm with Philip on going easy on the interest rate, and the reason is, my reason is a little different. My reason is that very high interest rate will also make the peso cheaper. Will cause the peso to appreciate now. And I am, by the way, probably it's known to you, I'm an advocate of the costly dollar policy. Next, please. That's only a discussion of the last slide. So, next, please. This is how the exchange rate, the peso exchange rate trajectory looks like from 2000. It's a rather jagged trajectory. So we were in 2003, starting 2003, we already reached 55, and then it went up to 56 in 2004, and then it started a trajectory downwards until it was 40, and then of course in 2013 it was again It was again at 40. And then started to depreciate once more. The inflation rate throughout this period is about, the last 5 years for the Philippines is about 2.5%. That's within target of the BSP. Now let's contrast the experience with that of Vietnam. Next, please. Okay. That's all right. Because on inflation, by the way, we already also reached 5.6% in 2004, 2005. This is something to do, of course, with the political turmoil following the 2004 election and the Hayat 10 resignation. So the cause of this turmoil is a little different today, because today a lot of it is foreign generated. This is the trajectory of the Vietnamese dong exchange rate. My own impression is that it's ever weaker, ever weaker. And but it also, by the way, it appreciated in the last week 10%, where all the others were depreciating 10%. This is a replay in the opposite. What happened in 2020? In 2020, because of the weakening peso, everyone appreciated, except, you know who? Vietnam did not appreciate. I have a feeling that Vietnam is following the lead of its older, its big brother, big brother China, because China's exchange rate also appreciated this time around. You know? And so, Romy, I'm sorry, but I'm an admirer of the experience of countries that have declared themselves independent from the trilemma. They simply said, we're out of the circuit. We're not going to be the slave of the capital markets, global capital markets, and that's of course China and Vietnam. But of course, they are acting out of the box in a sense, because most everyone else is acting within the box. Next slide, please. Next slide. That is the trajectory of China. China is another of those countries that have declared themselves independent from the trilemma. In 1994, Toti and myself, we were in a group advocating for the devaluation of the peso. And the reason is China devalued 40%. We knew that China is going to eat our lunch. And China did. Of course, as many of the advocacies where I joined up, talo kami at that time. Today, no? We lost that one. But we were with Padaranga and Joke no, yes. By the way, I remember Jokno making a comment, not associated with this, but when he was during the Aquino administration, I think very directly used the phrase, the crime of underspending. I don't know if you remember that. The crime of underspending under Aquino. But he was right. He was right. But now, of course, he is in a very different position. Okay, next please. Next. This was introduced by the speaker. I forgot your name. What's the name? I'm very poor at names, remembering names, sorry. Depreciation forced by local force majors, payments crisis, the local imbalances, boom and busts, especially busts. And then there's depreciation forced by outside pressure, which is what essentially we have now. Then there's depreciation adopted as part of an encompassing pro-tradable ecology. I consider PRC 94 and Vietnam in 2010. My own feeling is that 1 and 2 have substitution effects on consumption. But 3 is what I like, because it has substitution effect in investment from non-tradables to tradables. Next, please. As I mentioned earlier, there's an iron law of progress. Without investment, you don't get much growth. The Philippine investment rate historically has lagged behind its Asian rivals. The Duterte administration tried to correct this, and that is correct. That is the correct policy. The problem is now, we just don't have the money, because the fiscal situation has deteriorated. My own feeling is that we should try to encourage direct foreign, well, apart from PPP, direct foreign investments. If you look at the career of Aquino, did not seem to have done very much, but direct foreign investments was rather strong at the time. And that is why the growth rate of, the average growth rate of Aquino, about 6.2%, is now not even smaller than the average growth rate of Duterte, which is quite strange. I'm minus the pandemic here. It should have been higher, my own feelings. Okay, next please. Well, the problem now, of course, is, I've mentioned that, and the speakers before us mentioned it as well. National debt, fiscal deficit, and outgrowing the debt burden is how we should approach it. Economic growth has two aspects. One is quantity aspect of economic growth, and the other is quality aspect of economic growth. Quantity aspect is brute force. Just raise the GDP, wherever you can get it, just raise it. At the moment, that will help. Raise the GDP wherever you can get it. Whether it's in retail trade, by returning normalcy, just get it, because that's good for the economy. But if you can, and this is where we should take advantage of this crisis, why not have quality growth as well? Quality growth means that the growth drivers from sectors that are more inclusive, sectors that have more durable or lengthy recovery episodes, because they are more inclusive. Next, please. This is my observation from our group study, which is when tradables drive growth, there's faster poverty reduction. If you drive growth in manufacturing and agriculture, there you will have more poverty reduction. You have growth that has longer durations. This is the very famous study by, I'll give you the name later, where the more inclusive the growth, the longer the duration of growth episodes. When non-tradables drive growth, however, you still have growth and it's still good, except that it's less, it's more subject to boom and bust. As you know, non-tradables are subject to boom and bust. There's a narrower local market, and therefore more subject to saturation. And then finally, it is less inclusive and shorter duration, because at some point it becomes a bust. Next, please. No, so my group has focused on investment rate, GDCF, as percentage of GDP. And what are the determinants? Associations lang ito. Hindi ito causation. I'm not that sophisticated. So, but it is positively and strongly correlated with one, the share of manufacturing GDP. Foreign direct investments, so that's probably where. And the other thing is, simple currency depreciation does not do it. But currency depreciation under strong governance does it. It does have a strong positive effect on the investment rate. Negatively and strongly with service sector share growth. Negatively and strongly with service sector share. Next, please. So the takeaway is, the way we interpret the data for low-income countries is, simple currency depreciation has not changed investment. So as to the question of that was mentioned earlier, competitive devaluations, it's not going to help you if you are not supported by a strong economic governance. Because competitive devaluation will only be interpreted as, one, you're just nasty. And it's zero sum. The other guys will not take it lying down. And of course, just simple volatility from global economic pressures. So it's unsustainable and no change in investment behavior. So change in investment behavior has something very important to do with the rule of law. That is what changes investment. Thank you. I'm sorry, next please. I think I'll stop there.